Why do dealerships refuse to drop their prices? Well, it's simple and it's not so simple. You've got human factors and you've got business, and it doesn't mix very well. And I've learned a few things. Unfortunately, I've got a few gray hairs to show for that. Yes, but I've learned a few things along the way. And the bottom line is they're a business. They're unscrupulous. They know what it takes to sell a car and maximize their profits. That's why they do what they do. But while you have pressures from the bank as well as the OEMs or the factories to continually bearing down on individual dealerships to sell their products, they say, here, we're producing at a record volume. You've got to take these vehicles. So the dealers now on the other end trying to take all these vehicles, and that's why we see all these vehicles sitting on the car lots. But the flip side is they can't almost accept the fact that they're going to drop their prices. They're almost sort of committed. So what we see now are dealers that have this over commitment of the floor plans. And the floor plan costs, of course, are the credit cost to own those vehicles. And when you look at a car lot and you see 250 cars down the car lot here, well, the majority of those vehicles aren't owned outright by the dealership, and they're not owned outright by the factory. They're actually somewhere in between. Each dealer has to pay a monthly service on that vehicle towards principal and, of course, interest charges. So they have to continually pay down like you're paying on your car. When you take a car out for a certain loan period, you have to take payments and you're making that monthly charge. Now, it feels like a burden, right? It feels like a liability, right? That's because it is. And dealerships see that as a liability. It's an ongoing cost. It's a parasitic cost. So if they can get a car in off the truck from the dealer, from the actual manufacturer, they get it, they land it. If they can sell it within 25 days, 20 days, it's a win in their pocket. Unfortunately, some of these cars now we're seeing Stellantis, Ram, Jeep, those vehicles are sitting for 3, 4, and 5 and more months. Yes, they're some of the worst vehicles and worst offenders for not being able to sell their products. So why then, in fact, are they not dropping their prices? You ask the question, if they've got all these pressures to sell vehicles from the supplier to push those products out, well, it's quite simple. They're used to, the baseline has been elevated. We've seen people were willing to pay all this money during the last 3 or 4 years. People were literally willing. And sadly, that's what we've come to, is the consumer has risen that expectation. So now, why are they not dropping prices? Well, part of it is because consumers were okay in paying too much money. People were taking on a large amount of debt. They didn't seem to care. They were able to get money, and the banks were a little bit of an enabler. They were allowing people to take debts for 7 or 8 years for a car loan. By that time, most of these OEM dealers and these cars, you think about Jeeps and trucks from the big three, and some of the domestic products won't even last that long. Even a lot of the other the import brands like Toyota and Hondas are going to struggle to make it 10 years. So by the time you're done paying off a loan at 8 years, you'd be lucky if you even have a car that's worth driving. It's basically relegated to beater status. But what's going on is they're putting the pressure, and they're also enabling people to buy these vehicles at these high interest rates. The banks were making money, the OEMs were making money, and the dealerships were making money because they were throwing all kinds of extras, and people were just willing to pay it willy-nilly, and they weren't even asking a question because there was lots of competition, there was lots of people around. But see, what I see is the OEMs were selling and the dealers were bringing on more of those vehicles. The Lightnings. Initially, it was the EVs. Now we know that that's sort of taken a bit of a back seat because they're not selling as well. But a lot of these manufacturers and the dealerships specifically are decided to sell vehicles with higher profit margins. Larger pickup trucks that can stuff all kinds of technology, SUVs, bigger SUVs particularly, and more luxury vehicles. Luxury vehicles sold very, very well. 2020, 2022, and 23, luxury vehicles were the big hit. And so there was all kinds of margin in there for the OEMs. And so that's why they raised their expectation. Both the dealerships and the manufacturers raised their expectations, and now they don't want to go back down and sell these base little cars and Corollas and all these entry-level $15,000 cars. So now where does that leave people like us? Well, we can't afford that $110,000 truck. So now what we're finding is even car prices for the low-end stuff, the Corollas and even the base Civics and the Kias and some of those lower-end vehicles are now higher than what we're used to because people can't pay that $100,000, so they're looking at the next tier down and they're saying, well, maybe I have to settle for a Civic rather than the topped out Accord. So This is what's happened. We have raised that expectation of the dealership. Unfortunately, as a consumer, we were part to do with this. And now the dealerships almost can't retract. They're tooled up, they're producing vehicles with high margins, and they just don't want to go back to the old way of doing business. They don't even have to really work for it in a lot of cases. So now we have seen a little bit of a swing, but we haven't seen enough swing yet. Now, while some OEMs and some dealerships have adopted and have absolutely adjusted to the new way of being, they're becoming more flexible. We're seeing better interest rates, some incentives. The reality is there's still a lot of dealers that just aren't dealing, and they want to hold steady and state. So here's one thing that I've kind of learned through the years. Now, I've owned numerous vehicles. I've probably owned 30, 40 vehicles of my own. I've driven hundreds of vehicles, and I've been in the business for many, many years. So I want to say, in my personal experience, I'll give you 3 examples of some things that I've walked out with phenomenal deals. Years ago, I wanted to buy this Mustang GT. It was a 5-speed or 6-speed, whatever it was at the time, 5-liter V8. It was the last of that breed before they moved to the 4.6. And I went into the dealership, and they were asking $20,000 for this car. Slightly used, it had low Ks, it was a beautiful car, good spec. I was ready to buy it. I went in there, test drove it, and the dealership was standing pretty firm on that price. This back and forth game went on a little bit, went from 20, and I said, no, I'll pay 14 grand. It seemed like an absolutely ludicrous thing to do, but don't worry about it. Don't worry about insulting these people. That's their business. That's their line of work. The worst thing they do is say, sorry, we can't help you. And that's okay. Just you have to be willing to walk. And that's the other reason why a lot of these dealers aren't moving on their prices, because emotions kick in. Emotions. Oh, that new shiny toy. And people get all excited about that new shiny car, sports car, pickup truck, Jeep, and they're okay in spending more money. But put the emotions aside just for a moment. Get past that. And also put the emotions aside about offending these people. Walk in there, talk business, right to the point. You know if you're getting rooked or not. So you have to put those emotions aside. Don't worry about it. I went in there with this Mustang and I said 14 grand. He came back with 18.5. I said 14.2. He said 18. I said 14.2. He said 16. 14.2. This went back and forth, and I stood my ground. At one point, this went around and around. I literally sat in the dealership for about an hour and a half. Then he said, look, okay, I'll talk to the manager again. I don't think he's going to move. He goes, comes back. Okay, how about 15.5? 14.2 is what I said. He said, okay, I'll tell you what. Give us an extra $100. We'll wrap it up. You can take it away today. I said, no, I'm not giving you that extra $100. 14.2 or I'm out the door. Well, this humming and hawing. He said, go grab a coffee. I'll talk to the manager. I did that, came back and forth. And they shook my hand, 14.2. You know, they were pissed off. They were swearing under their breath, but they handed me the keys, and they probably were still making $1 or $2 on the wholesale price of that vehicle. It was a good car. I owned it for about 5 or 6 years. I drove it. There was not a thing wrong with it. I sold it, and I still made a profit on the back end, but because I was hard on the game. I'll give you another example. Another example was I bought a Jeep Wrangler. Back in the day, it was called a TJ, and it had the straight 6. It was also a manual gearbox. And it was one of those vehicles, army green, if you can imagine. It was just, it fit the epitome of a Jeep. I love that thing. It was amazing. Back when Jeep was kind of fun. And so I went in there and I test drove it, same storyline. Different dealership, it's a few years later. And we got into the negotiations game after the test drive. And this went back and forth a few times. They weren't meeting in the middle, and they certainly weren't anywhere near where I wanted to be. I said, here's my bottom line. No, manager, he's over there barking. The sales guy comes over, and this back and forth, and they're playing. So, the salesman, what you actually get is the salesman comes over, and he's like, I want to be on your side. Like, come on, man. I don't get much commission. And they'll play these games. Again, they're appealing to your emotions. I don't make much money from this. They pay us $150 flat rate, but the dealership, they just want to get rid of this thing. Don't worry about the manager. Like, you know what? I'll help you out. I'll do what I can. I'll work with you, but come on, you got to give us a little bit more. And so they'll try to appeal to you and make it seem like they're on your team. But I kind of looked through that noise, and they weren't meeting me where I wanted to be. So I said, I'm good. We'll talk to you later. Give me your business card. I walked out the door. my wife in front of me. I was literally about at the door, grabbing the door handle of my car, and I was getting into my car, and the guy comes running out. Whoa. And he's like, whoa, stop, stop, stop. He says, just 1 second. Can you come back in for a second? And so we went back into the dealership, and he was ready to write up the paperwork. And we literally signed the paperwork. I took the deal. They cleaned it up, and I picked up the vehicle. And 2 days later, after I got insurance and registration, and I was on my merry way. And I literally probably got, I think it was $5 or $6 grand off of their asking price. And again, I felt really good about the final deal I got on that vehicle. So you can't get your emotions wrapped up. And the problem was people were doing that. And the other problem was they felt desperation and they wanted to buy these cars. And no muss, no fuss. They just want to pay full beans. And the dealerships were taking full advantage of that. And the banks were over here enabling, saying, yeah, we'll hand you out all kinds of loans. Even subprime borrowers were getting loans for decent types of vehicles. And so now that's why people are in negative equity. People are, there's lots of repossessions. People are upside down on their loans and mortgages because people didn't have a sense of restraint. And you have to have restraint, and you have to leave emotions out of the game. I'll give you another story. Years ago, I bought this Lamborghini. Now, by no means rich. When I say that, it was a Gallardo, so it was a lower end Lambo. It was an older model. It was kind of base model, and I was really looking to flip the car. That's really all I wanted from it. It looked like an opportunity to get into a entry level supercar and try to make a buck. So I went. And I know what the pricing was for most of those vehicles. And this particular unit was already about 20 grand low from what the other cars were. So I look at this, and where this guy was situated, he's in the middle of the Okanagan, southern BC. He wasn't near any dealerships. The nearest Lambo dealership was in Vancouver, which was another, I think, 7 hours away from this city. And the other way, there was another 7 hours to Calgary. So he was right smack in the middle, and he could not necessarily get that car to get a pre-purchase inspection done on it. Now this guy, he took it in on a business trade, and anyway, he wasn't really an enthusiast, and that was good too. That worked in my favor. So you have to smell out, it's almost like shark smelling blood in the water. You have to smell out the whole scenario. So this is a private deal this time. And so I was on vacation, and I was kind of had my eye on this car for a while, and I watched, and that's the key. That's the other reason why these dealers might hold stronger. If they know they've got vehicles that are constantly rotating through and they're selling hot like hotcakes, you know you're going to have a harder time making a deal on that. But if you're watching those late model or those specialty vehicles that are maybe niche or they're not selling so well, that's what you want to keep your eye on right there, because that's what I always typically do. I keep an eye, specifically we're talking used vehicles, keep an eye on those used vehicles. And if they're sitting, that's where I come in for the strike. So that's what I did here. I kept an eye on this car, and it didn't sell for about 2 months. So I went down there. I was on vacation. I'm from Edmonton. I took a trip down to Kelowna, is where this car actually was in Osoyoos. I went down, had a look at this car, and asked for records. Well, he didn't have any records. Okay. The car ran flawless. It was beautiful. It was clean, pretty immaculate. And coincidentally, I'll share the rest of that in a second. But I looked it over. I've done a ton of mechanical work. Let's put it that way. I'm not a certified mechanic, although I know lots about it. I called my mechanic buddy back in Edmonton. I asked him what are the key points to look for. He walked me through it. We checked every point I could. We test drove it. Everything looked good. It drove perfectly. But then I said to the guy, I said, do you have any proof when the clutch was done? Because everybody knows Lamborghinis and they have weak clutches, and it's about a $15,000 tab if you're paying for a new clutch to be done on these cars. So I said, do you have any records on that? He said, well, no, I don't have any records on any recent history for servicing or any of that. So I said, so we're dealing with a Lamborghini with notoriously high repair and maintenance costs, and these clutches are going to cost 15 grand. We have to assume the clutch is gone. It could go in 2 weeks, right? He didn't have any way to argue that. He couldn't get a pre-purchase inspection done. I said, if you can get a pre-purchase done at the dealer, I'll pay for that. But if he didn't want to transport the vehicle and go through all that hassle, he wanted to cut a deal. So I said, look, you're already low. I get it. But I have to assume that it's going to need a clutch. I have to assume I need to do a tune-up. So I knocked off 15 grand. I knocked off some other incidentals, some cosmetics. I want to put some paint protection film on there. It didn't have it, and I wanted to bring it to Alberta. Everybody knows lots of rocks on the road here. So I grinded them hard to the point where I got I got this car for a song and a dance. Let's put it that way. And so I got the car home. The way it works out, the clutch lasted another 4 years because I drove the car as is. I put some paint protection film in, got the wheels refinished and put a new set of rear tires on it. And all I did was put another 3 or 4 grand in, drove another 4 years, put another clutch in. I got a cut and smoke and deal from the dealer who did the clutch for me off season, and I paid 10 grand for the clutch job. And I ended up spending 15 grand, put an aftermarket exhaust, and I actually made money in the car in the end. So you got to be willing to look for those weaknesses, look for those flaws, pull the emotion out of the game. And that's what I've been willing to look at. Floor plan costs. We also know that dealers are often motivated, but again, they're only more motivated on cars that have been sitting. And that's why the floor plan cost is a bigger factor for cars that sit. Again, don't go for the hottest and the latest and greatest. The way I see this, cars like the Z06 Corvette or one of the hottest cars in the market right now, don't go for those cars. Wait it out. Maybe find a used market where somebody is getting desperate to flip it, or maybe wait a couple of years until that car becomes, a better deal and not such a hot potato. So clearly, that's what's going on. They know that people are desperate. They know that people are buying with emotion, and they know that up until about this last few months, people have had all kinds of disposable cash. They were sitting at home. The banks were throwing money out like it was going out of style. And that's why dealers haven't been moving and are not willing to sell cars at a discount. However, this is changing. And mark my words, start watching after after tax season, and watch as the next 6 months roll on. You might see more and more and more discounts, more desperation, more people trying to relieve themselves of being underwater. Or, you might get some phenomenal, slightly used vehicles in the next year or so. Watch out for those deals. This isn't necessarily the time, but the dealers, interestingly enough, aren't that intentional about offering up great deals. And the few that are holding stiff and not willing to negotiate, well, they're going to pay the price. And there are dealerships, I've already seen them closing their doors. I've seen a few dealerships already here in this area in Edmonton, where they've closed their doors and they've re-asphalted the floors and they've sold it to a new buyer and somebody else moving in and repurposing that space or that real estate because these dealerships are not able to sell the cars and they're not remaining competitive. And it's a competitive industry, and if they're not willing to negotiate, they're definitely going to find themselves in hot water. So hope that helps everybody why these dealers aren't necessarily dropping their prices yet. And that's just the key word here. And you can't buy with emotion. Remember, keep that out of there. I definitely want to point this out as well. What's going on with GM and why are they not able to sell trucks? Yeah, it's actually making customers really upset. Hope to see each and every one on the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.